Everyone thinks the worst thing that happened at my daughter's wedding was the cake, but that was just the trigger. What they never expected was that I'd spent 30 years preparing for this moment without even knowing it. My name is Howard Delaney. I'm 56, and I live in a modest 3-bedroom house in Hoboken that I've owned since before my wife passed. Every morning follows the same rhythm: black coffee, newspaper, and 30 minutes tending to my backyard garden. Routine keeps me sane. Discipline keeps me grounded. And these tomato plants won't water themselves. Most people wouldn't guess I'm worth $1.2 billion. That's not a typo. I don't flash it around. Don't need to. The money sits in accounts, portfolios, and investments, while I drive my 10-year-old Camry and shop at the same grocery store where the cashiers know me by name. The call came early April. I was pruning basil when my phone buzzed. Amber's name lit up the screen. Dad. Her voice bubbled with excitement. Brandon proposed. We're getting married. My daughter, 27 and brilliant, sounded like the little girl who once climbed trees in our backyard. I forced enthusiasm into my voice while my stomach knotted. That's wonderful, sweetheart. Tell me everything. She did, in vivid detail, how Brandon took her to Central Park at sunset, how he'd hired a photographer to capture the moment, how the diamond caught the light just so. How his family, the Mercers, had already started planning the celebration. His parents are amazing, Dad. Stuart and Darlene have connections everywhere. They own half of Manhattan real estate, practically. I nodded, though she couldn't see me. Brandon Mercer, Executive VP at Mercer Holdings, poised to take over the family empire. I'd met him 3 times, and each time something cold slithered beneath his polished surface. What Amber didn't mention was how he'd snapped at our waiter during dinner last month, how he'd ignored our Uber driver completely, how he'd referred to his building's concierge as the help, with that slight curl of his lip. At Thanksgiving, he'd made a joke about people who shop at Walmart. I didn't laugh. He noticed. When's the big day? I asked, keeping my voice steady. 3 months. The Mercers have this incredible venue in the Hamptons on hold. 3 months. Not much time for what I needed to do. Amber, I said carefully, I'd like to ask you something important. What is it, Dad? Her voice tensed slightly. I want you to keep my financial situation private from Brandon and his family, at least until after the wedding. Silence hummed between us. Dad, why would I do that? They're going to be family. I chose my words with precision. I need to know how they treat someone who has nothing to offer them. That's ridiculous. Brandon loves me, not your money, which he doesn't even know about. Then it shouldn't be a problem, I said gently. I'm not trying to control you, Amber. I'm trying to protect you. A sigh crackled through the phone. Fine, but the Mercers are particular, about appearances, about status. I understand. And I did, more than she realized. 2 weeks later, we met the Mercers at Elysian, a Michelin-starred restaurant where the waitstaff moved like ghosts and the wine list read like a novel. I wore my navy suit, decent quality, but nothing special. Brandon's parents arrived in matching Brunello Cucinelli. Stuart's watch alone probably cost more than my car. Stuart dominated the conversation, punctuating his stories with confident laughs while his eyes calculated everyone's worth. Darlene's smile never reached her eyes as she assessed my cuffs, my collar, my shoes. So, Howard, Stuart said while cutting into his $160 steak, Amber tells us you work in tech consulting? Something like that, I replied. A half-truth. I invest in tech. I consult no one. Fascinating, he said, not meaning it. We should talk about opportunities at Mercer Holdings. Always room for entry-level specialists. Brandon smirked into his Bordeaux. How thoughtful, I replied, taking a bite of my salmon while they exchanged glances. I'd ordered the cheapest entree deliberately. "Howard's being modest," Darlene cut in. "I'm sure he does very well for himself in Hoboken, was it?" The way she said it, Hoboken, like it was some distant, primitive outpost. "Dad loves his neighborhood," Amber interjected, tension creeping into her voice. "Of course he does," Stewart nodded sympathetically. "Government-subsidized housing can be quite adequate." Brandon chuckled. Amber's face flushed. After dessert, I handed Amber a small velvet box. Inside lay a Victorian-era silver locket I'd found at an estate sale for $37. I'd cleaned and restored it myself. "It has 2 spaces," I explained. "One for your mother, one for your future." Amber's eyes welled up. "Dad, it's beautiful." From across the table, I heard Darlene whisper not quite quietly enough to her friend. "He couldn't even spring for Tiffany's?" As we left, Brandon made a show of offering me a ride. "We can definitely fit you in," he said loudly, then added under his breath, "unlike that old Camry of yours." In the car ride home, Amber was quiet until we hit the Holland Tunnel. "They're just rich, Dad, not evil." Her voice had an edge I rarely heard. "Wealth doesn't create cruelty," I replied softly. "It reveals it." She turned sharply. "You're being controlling again." The word stung. Controlling. Like when I'd tried to warn her about a toxic friendship in high school. Like when I'd suggested therapy after her mother died. "You don't see what they're really like," I tried. "No, you don't see me," she snapped. "Brandon sees me. You just want to protect a version of me that doesn't exist anymore." She demanded I stop at a gas station, called Brandon to come get her. "Urban sees me," she repeated, grabbing her purse. The door slammed behind her. I waited until she was safely inside the store, then drove home alone. The next morning, I stared at my kitchen table, the same one where we celebrated her college acceptance with grocery store cake. Now I wondered if I'd just lost her for good. You don't realize how loud a house can be until the person who fills it goes quiet. The morning after our fight, I woke to the sound of nothing. No text messages, no voicemails, just the hollow echo of an empty house that once felt full. I made coffee for 2 out of habit, then poured the second cup down the drain. I opened the kitchen drawer where I still kept Amber's childhood drawings. A stick figure labeled Daddy stood next to a smaller one with yellow crayon hair, both smiling, both holding hands. I closed the drawer quickly. Her coffee mug, the one with the chipped handle she refused to let me replace, sat untouched in the cabinet. I'd bought it for her 16th birthday, a silly thing with "World's Okayest Daughter" printed on it. She'd called it peak dad humor and used it every morning through high school. I left her a voicemail that first day. Just a simple, "I love you." Nothing else. On day 3, "Maybe I came across harsh. Let's talk." By day 7, I left a rambling message about the time she broke our neighbor's window with a baseball. How instead of lying, she'd marched up to their door, admitted everything, and offered her allowance to pay for repairs. "You always knew right from wrong," I said into the phone. "I've always been proud of that." She didn't call back. I tried distracting myself. Organized old photo albums. Amber at age 5 in her Princess Halloween costume, missing her front teeth. Amber at 18 in her graduation gown, looking so much like her mother, it made my chest ache. I cooked recipes we used to make together. Her mother's lasagna, the banana bread we perfected during COVID. Nothing tasted right. The garden became my obsession. I watered the tomatoes twice daily until they started rotting on the vine, everything dying from too much care. Most people don't know how I made my money. They don't need to. It was San Francisco, 1995. I lived in a studio apartment with water stains on the ceiling. Dinner was usually canned beans or day-old bagels from the shop down the street. I was 30 and already feeling left behind by the tech boom happening around me. Then 2 scruffy college dropouts pitched me their idea in a coffee shop. They talked fast, sketching diagrams on napkins, an information-sharing platform that would revolutionize how businesses communicated. Everyone else had turned them down. I invested my entire savings, $5,000 for 10% equity. It was all I had. 18 months later, Axion Link was acquired for $42 million. My cut was just over $4 million. I reinvested almost all of it. Quietly built a portfolio, never upgraded my lifestyle, even after Amy died, and it was just Amber and me. I believed then what I believe now. Character matters more than status. Sometimes I open my desk drawer and look at the portfolio statements, holdings worth 9 figures, private equity stakes that would make Stuart Mercer's eyes bulge. None of it brings peace on nights like these. I regretted asking Amber to lie about my wealth. Regretted giving her that locket instead of something shiny from Tiffany's, but still wondered, if she couldn't see Brandon for who he was, did she really understand what love looked like? After 2 weeks of silence, I checked her Instagram. There she was, smiling with the Mercers at some Napa Valley vineyard. Her caption, "Grateful for family who believes in me." No mention of me. A friend had commented, "Where's your dad?" No reply. I couldn't sleep. Couldn't eat. Couldn't focus on anything but the growing hole in my chest where my daughter used to be. 3 weeks after our fight, I went to a local boutique and bought a crystal vase. $68, hand-blown by an artist whose card said she worked out of a garage studio in Red Hook. It wasn't expensive, but it was thoughtful. I wrote a simple card, "Wishing you love and understanding in your marriage." I hesitated before signing it. Just wrote Howard instead of Dad. Then the call came, not from Amber, but from an unknown number. "Mr. Delaney?" A woman's voice, cautious. "Yes?" "My name is Elena Monroe. I used to work for Stuart Mercer." I sat down, suddenly alert. "How can I help you, Ms. Monroe?" "Actually, I'm calling to help you." She paused. "Be careful. They destroy people quietly, especially ones who don't play along." "What do you mean?" I asked, but she had already hung up. I stared at the phone, heart racing. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I Googled Stuart Mercer, found nothing suspicious, just charity galas, real estate developments, and corporate acquisitions. The perfect digital footprint. Then I searched Stuart Mercer lawsuit and found 3 results buried on page 4, all settled out of court, all with ironclad NDAs, all former employees. I was still processing this when, 30 days after our fight, my phone rang. Amber's name lit up the screen. "Dad." Her voice was tight, controlled, no warmth. "Amber." I matched her tone, afraid to hope. "The wedding's tomorrow. I want you there." I closed my eyes, relief washing over me. Of course I'll be there. "There are conditions." The word stung. Conditions. Like a business arrangement. No facial expressions of disapproval. No side comments. No drama. Just smile. Just walk me down the aisle. I swallowed hard. I understand. Good. A pause. "The ceremony starts at 4. Don't be late." She hung up before I could say anything else. I sat in silence, staring at the untouched crystal vase on my coffee table. Then I went to the bathroom mirror and practiced smiling. Rehearsed the lines I'd need to say tomorrow. "You look beautiful. I'm so proud of you. I wish you all the happiness in the world." None of them felt true anymore, but I'd say them anyway. Even if I had to watch her marry a mistake, I'd be there. That's what a father does. I laid out my suit, the only good one I owned. Not fancy enough for the Hamptons, but clean and pressed. As I buttoned the jacket, checking the fit, my phone buzzed with a weather alert. 75 degrees and sunny in the Hamptons tomorrow. But storms don't always start in the sky. I spent that night alone in my garden, sitting on the old wooden bench where Amber used to read books as a teenager. The moon cast long shadows across the tomato plants I'd nearly killed with care. Tomorrow I would watch my only child marry into a family that saw kindness as weakness. I would smile and shake hands with people who thought my worth could be measured by the car I drove or the address on my mail. And I would do it all without revealing the truth, that I could buy and sell the Mercers 10 times over. The only thing that gave me comfort was knowing that character, real character, reveals itself over time. And when Brandon's mask finally slipped, I'd be there to pick up the pieces. What I didn't know then was how quickly that mask would fall, or how spectacularly it would shatter. The Grandview Pavilion was built to impress, but today it would serve a very different purpose. It would become a monument to their own downfall. I arrived early, per Amber's instructions. The venue was everything you'd expect from old money trying to make a statement. Expansive manicured lawns, towering white columns, and a valet circle packed with vehicles worth more than most people's homes. Bentleys, Maybachs, and Escalades gleamed in the afternoon sun, while attendants in crisp uniforms scurried around them. The valet's smile faltered when I pulled up in my Toyota Camry. He hesitated before taking my keys, as if touching them might somehow tarnish his white gloves. "Just park it somewhere visible," I said, handing him a 20. "I might need to leave quickly." Inside, the air smelled of lilies, polished marble, and money. A hand-lettered sign directed guests to the Mercer Delaney wedding. I noted my name came second. Darlene Mercer spotted me in the grand foyer before I could find somewhere to blend in. She approached with what I'd come to recognize as her weaponized smile. All teeth. No warmth. The bride's father made it. How wonderful. Her voice carried just enough to draw attention from nearby guests, who turned to assess me. Stuart materialized beside her, clasping my shoulder too firmly. "Hope the drive from Hoboken wasn't too taxing. You must have had to leave early in that reliable old car." Brandon walked by, champagne flute in hand, without acknowledging my presence. He was working the room, shaking hands with men in expensive suits, kissing cheeks of women dripping in diamonds, networking at his own wedding. The other guests regarded me with curious politeness. I was the man they'd heard existed, but knew nothing about. The bride's mysterious father, who'd appeared from nowhere, wearing an off-the-rack suit to a multi-million-dollar affair. "Family photos. Immediate family only, please," called the photographer, a slender woman with 3 cameras hanging from her neck. I moved toward the designated area, but Darlene intercepted me with practiced grace. "Perhaps wait here. The lighting's tricky with the windows, and we've planned a very specific arrangement." Brandon said nothing, eyes fixed on his cufflinks. Amber, surrounded by makeup artists for a final touch-up, didn't notice the exchange. I stood near the coat rack, watching as the Mercers posed for formal family portraits with Amber at the center, the perfect picture of Manhattan royalty welcoming a new princess. They took 20 different combinations. Not once was I asked to join. The ceremony space was a cathedral of excess, gold-trimmed chairs arranged in 10 perfect rows, flowers imported from 3 continents, and a string quartet playing Bach. The first 3 rows were reserved for Mercer business associates, donors, and friends. I was seated in row 7, between Mrs. Dalka, from Stewart's Golf Club, and Jeremy, Darlene's distant cousin twice removed. "He's the bride's father?" I heard the woman behind me whisper. "I thought he'd be taller." When the music changed, signaling the ceremony's start, my heart hammered against my ribs. Then Amber appeared, radiant in white, and everything else faded away. For a moment, she was just my little girl again. I walked her halfway down the aisle, as arranged. At the midpoint, Stuart stepped forward to complete the journey to the altar. The symbolism wasn't subtle. I was half a father. A placeholder until something better came along. The ceremony proceeded flawlessly, choreographed like a Broadway production. I noticed how Brandon's vows sounded memorized, almost commercial in their polish. Amber's voice trembled with emotion, but she smiled through it all. During the cocktail hour, waiters circulated with Krug Clos du Mesnil champagne. I declined, each offered glass. Brandon's groomsmen, all wearing matching designer suits, gathered in a corner, laughing too loudly, talking too big. Brandon eventually made his way to me, champagne sloshing dangerously close to the rim of his glass. "Howard," he said, loudly enough for others to hear. "So, did you find something to wear last minute, or was that a pre-owned gem?" I smiled without showing teeth. "Congratulations, Brandon. You and Amber make a beautiful couple." His eyes narrowed slightly at my refusal to engage. He moved on to easier targets. The reception dinner was a blur of speeches praising Brandon's business acumen and Amber's grace. No one asked me to speak. No one mentioned how I'd raised her alone after her mother died. No one knew I'd paid for her college, her first apartment, her dream of becoming a writer. After dinner came dessert, a 5-tier cake with hand-painted sugar flowers that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage. I approached the dessert bar, looking for something sugar-free due to my type 2 diabetes. "Excuse me," I said quietly to a server. "Do you have any options without sugar?" The young man nodded. "Yes, sir. We have fruit and a mousse sweetened with stevia. The mousse would be perfect." "Thank you." Brandon appeared beside me, clearly having overheard. "Diabetic. That explains the Camry." He laughed at his own joke, then raised his voice. "Sugar-free mousse. What, can't afford insulin?" A few heads turned. Brandon was performing now. "You know, Howard here once asked me for a job," he announced to the small crowd gathering around us. "Wanted to consult for Mercer Holdings, in exchange for exposure." He made air quotes around consult. The lie stung, but I maintained my composure. Then Brandon pulled out his phone. "Look at this text Amber sent me a few weeks ago." He displayed the screen to his groomsmen. "My dad's being difficult again, always judging." I hadn't seen that text, didn't know if it was real or fabricated. Either way, the knife twisted deeper. "Brandon," I said quietly, "this is your wedding day. Let's not make it about me." "Oh, it's not about you," he replied, eyes cold. "It never was. Stay in your lane, old man. This isn't your story anymore." I adjusted my tie and took a slow breath. Inside, I was shaking, heart pounding against my ribs, hands clenched to hide their tremor. But I remembered Amber's request. No scenes. I also remembered Elna Monroe's warning. They destroy people quietly. Brandon wasn't done. He grabbed a dessert fork loaded with cake, waving it tauntingly near my face. "You haven't tried the cake, Howard. It's the best money can buy. Not that you'd know." His voice dropped to a whisper. "I know you disapprove of me, of this wedding. But after today, you'll be lucky if Amber even returns your calls." Before I could respond, he lunged forward, smashing the cake directly into my face. The force knocked me back a step as frosting covered my eyes, nose, and ears. Gasps erupted around us. Then laughter. Phones appeared, capturing my humiliation from every angle. I heard the wedding planner's horrified, "Oh my God," as the cake stand wobbled and the entire 5-tier masterpiece collapsed to the floor in a spectacular avalanche of fondant and buttercream. As I stood there, wiping frosting from my face, the crowd still laughing, I saw one thing clearly through the sugar glaze. Brandon had just made the most expensive mistake of his life. They thought they'd crushed a man with frosting. They didn't realize I'd been crushing empires since they were still in diapers. The room fell into a hush as Amber pushed through the crowd. Her face transformed from confusion to horror as she took in the scene. Me, covered in cake, Brandon, still smirking, the ruined wedding cake scattered across the marble floor. "What did you just do?" Her voice shook with rage, directed not at me, but at her new husband. Brandon's smile faltered. Relax, babe. He's being dramatic. I watched something shift in my daughter's eyes, a clarity I hadn't seen in months. Her face turned pale, then flushed with anger, then settled into something cold and certain. The slap echoed through the ballroom. Brandon's head snapped sideways from the force of Amber's palm against his cheek. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Brandon touched his face, disbelief giving way to embarrassment, then anger. "What the hell, Amber?" Stewart stood up, napkin still tucked in his collar. Darlene whispered frantically, "Do something." I stepped aside, cake still dripping from my chin. This wasn't my moment to intervene. Then something unexpected happened. A distinguished older gentleman with silver hair rose from table 12. He moved forward with the confident stride of someone accustomed to commanding rooms. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, voice cutting through the tension. "Allow me to properly introduce someone." He gestured toward me. "This is Howard Delaney, founding investor of Axion Link." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. A man who turned $5,000 into over $1 billion in less than 2 decades. He paused, allowing the information to sink in. "Some of you hold stock today because of him. The Mercers owe their hotel tech suite system to his code." The room shifted. Faces turned toward me, many registering recognition for the first time. "That's Howard Delaney? I thought he looked familiar. He's on the board of Callaway Systems." One of Brandon's groomsmen dropped his champagne glass. It shattered, but no one moved to clean it up. Stewart's face drained of color. Darlene visibly trembled. Brandon stood frozen, hand still pressed against his reddening cheek. The silver-haired man, Charles Beaumont, I now recognized him from tech conferences I'd occasionally attended, nodded respectfully in my direction before returning to his seat. Stewart recovered first, rushing toward me with an outstretched hand. "Howard, my goodness, why didn't you say anything?" Darlene fluttered nearby. "We had no idea. This is so embarrassing." Brandon tried to smile through his shock. "Sir, it was a joke. Please, we can talk this through." I remained silent, wiping cake from my eyes with the handkerchief Charles had discreetly handed me. The room waited for my response. For the first time that day, I had everyone's attention. When I finally spoke, my voice was low, but carried across the now silent ballroom. "You taught your son that wealth equals value." I looked directly at Stewart. "You taught him cruelty was power." My eyes shifted to Darlene. "Now the world gets to see where that leads." Brandon stepped forward, desperation in his eyes. "If I'd known you were rich, I never would have—" "Exactly," I cut him off. The single word landed like a gavel. Charles Beaumont stood again. "There's more." He addressed the room with the gravity of a prosecutor delivering closing arguments. Stewart tried to sabotage Axion Link in 1997. He knew Howard from the beginning. Stewart's face contorted. "That's absurd." "I have the emails," Charles continued calmly. "You knew who Howard was this whole time." Said nothing. "Let your son humiliate him knowingly." Charles turned to the stunned guests. "You didn't just raise a monster, you protected one." Brandon lunged toward me, panic in his eyes. "Mr. Delaney, please. My father's actions aren't mine. I didn't know." Amber stepped between us. "You're everything he warned me about." She twisted the diamond ring from her finger and threw it at Brandon's feet. "You lied to me. You lied to my father. You don't deserve either of us." The energy in the room shifted again. Guests who had been eagerly recording the cake incident now put away their phones, suddenly ashamed of their voyeurism. Others whispered among themselves, now curious about the quiet man they'd dismissed. The tables had turned completely. In a room full of wealth and status, I was suddenly the most powerful person present. And I hadn't changed a thing about myself. I straightened my frosting-stained jacket and walked slowly toward the exit. The crowd parted silently before me. At the door, I paused and turned back to the Mercers. "Consider this your wedding gift. The last time you'll ever see me." The bright afternoon sun hit my face as I stepped outside. The air smelled sweet, or maybe that was just the cake. I had barely made it 10 steps before I heard her voice, breathless and breaking. "Dad, wait." I turned to see Amber running toward me. The train of her wedding dress gathered in her arms, mascara streaming down her cheeks. In that moment, she looked exactly like the little girl who used to race to greet me after work. Messy, emotional, and completely real. I didn't move. Couldn't. 3 decades of investor discipline had taught me to wait, to let the other party show their full hand before making a move. She stopped a few feet away. "I'm so sorry." Her voice cracked. "You were right about everything." "Amber, no. Let me finish." She took a shaky breath. "I should have listened to you. I was so caught up in how they made me feel. Important, special, part of something grand, that I didn't see what they really were." I studied her face, looking for sincerity and finding it. "What changed your mind?" "It wasn't just the cake." She wiped at her tears, smearing expensive makeup. "This morning I overheard Brandon talking to his groomsmen. He said I was easy to control because of my daddy issues. Said he was going to convince me to put you in a retirement home by the end of the year." The revelation hit me hard, but I kept my expression neutral. "And you believe it now?" "I believe you," she said simply. "I always did, deep down. I was just afraid." "Of what?" "Of being alone." Her voice softened. "After Mom died, I was terrified of losing people. Brandon made me feel safe because he had this whole family, this empire that seemed permanent. But it was all hollow." I noticed Stuart and Darlene watching us from the doorway, their faces tense with calculation. Brandon was nowhere to be seen. "What happens now?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. Amber straightened her shoulders. "Now I walk away. From all of this." She gestured to the lavish venue behind her. "If you'll let me come home." For the first time that day, I smiled genuinely. The garden needs help. "I nearly killed the tomatoes." She laughed through her tears. "You always overwater them." I offered my arm. "Your chariot awaits. It's a Camry." As we walked toward the parking lot, I heard Charles Beaumont speaking quietly into his phone behind us. "Yes, liquidate all Mercer Holdings positions immediately and leak the story to the Journal." The revenge I hadn't asked for, but wouldn't stop. The justice of the market was already in motion. Tomorrow, the Mercers would wake to find their empire crumbling, not because I'd crushed it with my wealth or influence, but because they'd revealed their true character to the wrong audience. Sometimes karma wears a frosting-stained suit. She was supposed to walk down the aisle to applause. Instead, she ran across asphalt in designer heels to chase a man covered in cake. Amber hurried after me, lifting the hem of her $20,000 wedding dress to keep it from dragging across the parking lot. Her perfectly styled hair had come undone, mascara streaked her cheeks, and one of her diamond earrings was missing. She had never looked more beautiful to me. We reached my Camry in silence. Neither of us knew who should speak first. The weight of everything that had happened, and everything that hadn't, hung between us like a physical presence. "The wedding's off," she finally said, her voice stronger than I expected. "I can't marry him." I studied her face carefully. I'd been burned too deeply to accept her words at face value. "Are you saying that because you mean it, or because the cameras are off?" I asked quietly. Amber flinched as if I'd slapped her, but then her expression softened with understanding. "I deserve that," she admitted. "But Dad, I mean it. I really do." She took a deep breath. "This morning, before everything happened, I overheard Brandon talking to his groomsmen in the suite. He said I was easy to control, that I had Daddy issues. My jaw tightened, but I remained silent, letting her continue. He told them he'd been intentionally keeping me away from you, that he was planning to convince me to put you in a retirement home by the end of the year, so I'd be completely dependent on his family. Her voice broke. He said it would be easy because I was desperate for validation. The cold calculation of it struck me harder than any physical blow could have. And that's when you knew? She nodded, tears spilling again. That's when I knew you were right. But I was too scared to act on it until I saw what he did to you with the cake. That's when I finally saw him, really saw him. I leaned against the car, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation was ebbing, leaving me hollow. Why didn't you come to me this morning, after you heard him? Amber looked down at her hands, now bare of rings. Because I was ashamed, and because part of me was still desperately clinging to the fairy tale. I wanted so badly to believe I hadn't made such a terrible mistake. Her honesty broke something open inside me. For the first time, I truly understood what had drawn her to Brandon. After your mother died, I said carefully, I focused on giving you stability, security, but I never replaced what you lost. Amber looked up, surprise in her eyes. What do you mean? The Mercers offered you something I couldn't, a complete family, a mother figure, social validation. I met her gaze directly. You weren't just marrying Brandon. You were trying to fill the hole your mother's death left. She broke down then, really broke down, not the pretty tears of a bride on her wedding day, but the raw, ugly sobs of a 7-year-old girl who'd just lost her mother and never fully grieved. I sometimes resented you, she confessed between breaths. Your modest lifestyle, the way you never seemed to care what anyone thought. I wanted external validation so badly, and you never needed it. I reached out and took her hand, feeling the absence of the engagement ring that had adorned it just minutes ago. I don't need you to be perfect, I told her, but I need you to value yourself enough to walk away when you're not respected. She squeezed my hand tightly. I'm walking now. Toward you. Amber reached into a hidden pocket of her wedding dress and pulled out a folded document. The marriage certificate, she explained, handing it to me. I never submitted it to the county clerk. Something told me I'd need an exit plan. I looked at my daughter with renewed respect. Even in her worst mistake, she'd had the foresight to leave herself a way out. She was more like me than either of us had realized. Without warning, Amber walked to the decorative fountain near the entrance of the pavilion. She twisted her engagement ring off her finger, the 5-carat diamond Brandon had boasted cost more than my house, and threw it into the water with a decisive flick of her wrist. I'd rather lose a diamond than lose my father, she said, the sound of the ring hitting the water sharp and final. We walked back to the car together. I opened the passenger door like I used to when she was a kid. She gathered her massive silk dress into the small space, the absurdity of the moment not lost on either of us. A bride in full wedding attire, sitting in a decade-old Toyota, fleeing her own reception. As I walked around to the driver's side, I saw Amber looking back at the pavilion. Inside, guests had begun to notice she was missing. A small commotion was visible through the windows. Your phone's about to explode, I warned as I started the engine. She pulled it from another hidden pocket. The screen showed 15 missed calls already. Let it, she replied, powering it off completely. We drove away from the Grandview Pavilion in silence, windows down, the warm summer air rushing in. The quiet between us was different now, not charged with resentment or hurt, but with possibility. With peace. After several miles, Amber broke the silence. Now what? She asked softly. I thought about all the paths stretching before us, all the ways this day could have ended, and the way it actually had. I thought about the billions in my accounts and the simple joys of my garden, I thought about second chances and new beginnings. Now we live, I told her. We choose. Together. Her phone buzzed again in her lap, somehow still receiving notifications despite being powered off. The screen showed 48 missed calls from Brandon, his parents, and wedding planners. Without hesitation, she turned it off completely and rolled down the window further, letting the wind whip through her carefully styled hair. As we crossed the bridge back to New Jersey, I glanced at my daughter. The setting sun caught her profile, so like her mother's it made my chest ache. But for the first time in years, the ache wasn't painful. It was just love. Complicated, imperfect, and real. "They'll try to destroy you," she said suddenly. "The Mercers, they'll come after your investments, your reputation. Brandon won't let this humiliation stand." I smiled slightly. Let them try. What Amber didn't know, what the Mercers were about to discover, was that I'd spent decades building firewalls around my wealth and identity. My investments were protected by layers of LLCs and international holdings. My reputation in tech circles was unassailable because it was built on actual innovation, not inherited privilege. The Mercers had money. I had something far more valuable, the loyalty of people who'd worked with me because I treated them with respect, not fear. "Charles Beaumont," Amber said, realization dawning. "He was your plant." I shook my head. Not my plant. My friend. Someone who recognized Stuart Mercer's predatory business practices 20 years ago and has been waiting for the right moment to expose them. "You knew this would happen." "I didn't plan the cake," I admitted. "But I suspected Brandon would show his true colors eventually. Some people can't help themselves." The highway stretched before us, leading back to Hoboken, to my modest house with its overgrown garden, to real life. "I still want a family someday," Amber said quietly. "A husband, children." "You will have those things," I assured her, "with someone who sees you, the real you." Her phone lit up one final time before dying completely. Brandon's face appeared on the screen, a call coming through despite her attempts to silence it. Amber didn't even glance down. Instead, she tossed the phone into the back seat and leaned out the window, letting the wind wash over her face like freedom. Some inherit wealth, some build it, but real fortune, real legacy, is how you live after the empire burns. The Camry rolled to a stop in front of my modest two-story home in Hoboken. The porch light flickered on automatically, sensing our arrival. Amber stepped out, wedding shoes in hand, her once pristine dress now dusty and wrinkled. She stood for a moment, taking in the familiar sight of the house she'd grown up in. "Nothing's changed," she said softly. "Everything's changed," I corrected her, unlocking the front door. Inside, I made coffee, just like our old Sunday night ritual. I heated up leftover pasta from the fridge while Amber changed out of her wedding dress and into an old Rutgers sweatshirt she'd left behind years ago. We ate on paper plates at the kitchen table, and for the first time in a month, I heard her genuine laugh. "I can't believe I almost married into a family that uses gold cutlery," she said, twirling spaghetti around a plastic fork. "Did you see their faces when Charles Beaumont stood up?" I nodded, savoring the moment. Stuart knew exactly who I was from the beginning. He tried to sabotage Axion Link back in '97 when we were competing for the same contracts. "So he recognized you at the first dinner?" "Immediately. The whole charade, treating me like I was nobody, was deliberate." "A power play." Amber's expression darkened. "They're awful people." "They're scared people," I corrected. "Wealth without purpose terrifies them. They need status to feel valuable." We talked long into the night. Amber opened up about how she'd felt pressured to marry up, to achieve the kind of social standing her college friends seemed to value. I shared more about the early days of Axion Link, my decision to stay anonymous, and why I valued character over capital. I thought you were being stubborn by living like this, she admitted, gesturing to our modest surroundings. Now I see you were being free. Morning came with unexpected news. Charles Beaumont texted me. A video of the cake-smashing incident had gone viral. Over 2 million views overnight. Public sympathy poured in. Bride's billionaire father humiliated by arrogant groom. Brandon's past actions surfaced online. Clips of him yelling at baristas, leaving 0 tips on $300 meals, berating service workers. The internet had found its villain of the week. By noon, Mercer Holdings' stock had dropped 18%. By evening, the board of directors issued a statement distancing themselves from Brandon's behavior. A week later, Stuart Mercer was forced to resign as CEO. I gave one interview, on my terms. I didn't mention Brandon by name. Instead, I talked about respect, the power of humility, and the cost of forgetting where you came from. If money's the loudest voice in the room, I said, someone's got to speak for the silence. The clip became a rallying cry for a certain kind of quiet integrity that resonated far beyond what I'd intended. Amber left her job at the publishing firm. With my guidance, and yes, some of my capital, she launched a nonprofit called Fathers Forward that supported young women navigating estranged family relationships and toxic engagements. She ran workshops, hosted panels, and eventually published a guidebook, Walk Away with Grace. The antique silver locket I'd given her before the wedding. She now wore it daily. Inside were 2 photos, one of her mother and one of me at the wedding, face covered in cake, giving a proud, ironic smile. She'd had it engraved on the back. Love, unfiltered. Summer turned to fall. I tended to my garden, now thriving under our shared care. The tomato vines produced more than we could eat. Smells like summer, Amber said one evening as we harvested the last batch. Smells like freedom, I replied. 6 months after the wedding, that wasn't. A letter arrived addressed to Mr. Delaney and Ms. Delaney. It was from a young woman whose father had walked out after she'd gotten engaged to a man he disapproved of. She'd seen our story online. Your story saved me, she wrote. I didn't walk the aisle. I walked away instead. Thank you. Amber framed the letter. Hung it in the hallway beside family photos. The Mercers tried to rebuild their image, but the damage was done. Brandon became persona non grata in investor circles. His engagement announcements to a senator's daughter were quietly withdrawn 3 months later. People often ask me if I regret exposing my wealth that day after keeping it private for so long. I tell them the truth. I didn't expose anything. Brandon did. Stuart did. Darlene did. They revealed themselves through their actions, not their assets. We didn't crash their empire with money. We did it with truth. And sometimes, that's the most priceless thing you can own.